Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Summers, and I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. Thank you for joining us for our 28th annual Kuyper Lecture. I'd like to start by extending my gratitude to the University of Notre Dame, Washington, D.C. Public Affairs Office for their expert help when we very quickly found ourselves in need of a new venue for tonight's lecture. Thank you to those folks who've done a lot to make this evening possible. And I am also grateful for the good-natured response of the folks from Pro-AV DC and DC Taste, who said yes to being here tonight when we didn't even know where here was going to be. And lastly, for the hardworking Senate staffer who did all the work for our original planned location, I am grateful, and I'm glad that you are in this room. So, yes. This evening, we are also joined by several of our past Kuyper lecturers in that series of 28, welcome, as well as several members of CPJ's Board of Trustees who are in town for our fall board meeting that takes place over the next couple of days. One thing they will get to do is spend time with our Civitas Congressional Fellows, who are young people serving on Capitol Hill in their first 5 years of service. So they'll have a delightful lunch tomorrow, also in a rehomed space. All right, our agenda for tonight is pretty simple. I'm going to make a few remarks to provide context for the lecture and introduce our lecturer and our discussant. And then we'll hear from Gert-Jan Segers as our 28th annual Kuyper Lecture. And after Gert-Jan's remarks are finished, Chris Seiple will make a brief response, and then the three of us are going to have a discussion, followed by a moderated time of questions from you. So you can already be thinking about your question in the form of a question. So on to context. So the Center for Public Justice, if you're not familiar with us, is a nonpartisan, Christian, civic education and policy organization that is headquartered here. We seek to inspire and equip Christians to pursue a common calling to faithful citizenship and affirm the vital role of government in upholding public justice. The Center for Public Justice's annual Kuyper Lecture is named for Abraham Kuyper, born in 1837 and lived till 1920, who was an influential Dutch scholar-statesman whose many contributions to public life continue to influence Christians today. Kuyper believed that the Christian life cannot be confined to the church alone. Accepting Christ's claim of authority over the entire world, Kuyper sought to follow the implications of that faith into politics, journalism, the university, and other spheres of human endeavors. To that end, he founded the anti-revolutionary political party, launched the Free University of Amsterdam, edited newspapers, and served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905. So before I go any further, I'd like to lay out a few terms of reference that we're going to have featured the rest of this evening in our remarks. First, I'd like to speak briefly about the Dutch parliamentary system. Second, kind of the contrasting character of the representative government in the United States. And third, the diversity of the Dutch people. So first, the Dutch parliamentary system. For those of you that may have studied poetry undergrad like I did, you may not be as intimately familiar with the particulars of the Dutch parliamentary system. The Netherlands is a parliamentary democracy governed by the rule of law. Citizens elect representatives to Parliament, and the government, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, must retain the confidence of the elected House of Representatives. If that confidence is lost, the government falls, and a new coalition or new elections follow. The Dutch also use proportional representation. So seats, someone said yes.
You like that?
Sorry. So seats merit each party's vote share. No party wins an outright majority, making coalition governments the norm. By contrast, the United States is best described as a constitutional republic. Representative institutions, separation of powers, and checks and balances are designed to reflect popular will while limiting simple majority rule and protecting minority rights. Politically, power typically alternates between two major parties rather than among multi-party coalitions. And lastly, Dutch diversity. Americans tend to think of the Dutch as a single, unified people. In reality, the Netherlands has always been marked by strong regional and religious differences. As examples, the Frisians maintain their own language and identity, and the northern provinces were historically more Protestant, while provinces in the south remained largely Catholic, each with their own traditions and institutions. Dutch diversity has continued to grow increasingly more complex, from immigration from former colonies, as well as an influx of refugees in recent years. Today, Dutch society includes long-standing Christian and secular traditions alongside growing Muslim communities. These differences have often been sources of both cultural vitality and political tension. This, then, is the context within which Kuyper's ideas and practice took shape, within a framework that still shapes Dutch public life today. In this evening's Kuyper Lecture, The Afternoon of Democracy, How Faith Can Save Government of, by, and for the People, you will hear these key themes informed by Kuyper's life and practice. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Gert-Jan Segers. Gert-Jan Segers studied political science at University of Leiden and international relations at SAIS Johns Hopkins here in DC. He worked as a staffer in the Dutch Parliament, then journalist, founder, and director of a Christian study center in Cairo, director of the think tank of a Dutch Christian political party, the ChristenUnie, before starting his political career in The Hague and becoming a member of parliament, party leader of Christian Union, and member of the Dutch coalition government. Gert-Jan has published multiple books, including 2 novels, and he is married with 3 daughters. Welcome, Gert-Jan.
Distinguished guests, people serving at Capitol Hill, friends of Center for Public Justice, ladies and gentlemen, I do realize I come from a rather small country, less than 50% of the size of Virginia, with fewer people than the state of New York. I know. But I hope you do realize that without that small country called the Netherlands, we wouldn't be here. My old hometown Leiden hosted the Pilgrim Fathers for a couple of years before they sailed to the New World. We started building New Amsterdam, before, for some strange reason, afterwards was called New York. And of course, without one of our political leaders called Abraham Kuyper, we wouldn't have a Kuyper Lecture. So in other words, you're welcome. I know that you are having some political challenges and issues right now, like the shutdown that made us move here. But I will stay out of your political challenges, and I would like to take you on a journey to my country, my part of the world, the old world of Europe and the Netherlands in particular, to the land of Abraham Kuyper, great theologian, statesman, leader of the Dutch Reformed Church and the Dutch Reformed community a little over a century ago. And my guess is that we might discover that we have more in common than we thought. I hope that at least you will be able to make your application for your own American context. For almost 2 decades, I gave my best efforts to a political movement that works in Kuyper's tradition, as director of their think tank, member of parliament, and party leader. Stephanie already mentioned that. That brought us, and me personally, twice into a governing coalition of our country, a coalition with 4 very different parties, Christian and liberal, led by the current NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. And if you think that I look a little bit old for my age, those years are the reason. Doing politics in a coalition in the Netherlands is very a unique challenge. I mean, is very, very difficult in a more and more polarized society. It made me old and bold. Small as we are, the Netherlands, we always have had deep differences. My parents grew up in a village of lovely tulips with an invisible high wall between Protestant and Catholics. Both had their own churches, their own schools, grocery shops, soccer clubs, political parties, and never the twain met. The only difference with Northern Ireland was a political culture of plurality and a freedom to live and let live. But in real life, there was very little love between both communities. My father would become a Protestant pastor, and his neighbor, who would become the Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop of the Netherlands, were not allowed to play with each other. At the end of his life, the Archbishop told me that every evening he was praying for me as a political leader. It was a very moving moment of reconciliation. But as Protestants and Catholics became much more friendly to each other, we now face new deep divisions between secular and religious, between right and left, native Dutch and Dutch with an immigrant background, between city and countryside, rich and poor, people with academic education and people with practical education. And with our system of proportional representation, many groups have a voice in parliament, with now 12 different parties being represented. And the more parties we have, the deeper the cultural and political divisions we have. The louder the MPs are screaming, the lesser our system is able to come up with an agreement or a decisive compromise. Since my departure from politics, things have not gotten any better. And I'm not suggesting that there is a direct link between my leaving and the decline of democracy in the Netherlands. But the title of the lecture is not a fun one. The title is The Afternoon of Democracy. In this Kuyper Lecture, I want to show you that we are living in the afternoon of democracy. But also to ask what our calling is in this afternoon, and how we can look forward to a new morning. The image of the afternoon I borrow from the Czech priest and author Thomas Halík, who writes about the afternoon of Christianity. And I believe the two are deeply connected. In our lands, the conviction took root that we are all created in the image of God. Male nor female, slave nor free. In Christ there is neither Jew or Greek. In part because of this, we in the West came to the deep conviction that all are equal before the law. That is not a state of nature, that's not natural. Look around in the world today. But it goes back to a profound conviction, if you will, to faith. The relationship between Christian faith and democracy and freedom is also evident in the United States. The Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville came famously to the United States and looked around and he observed. And then he wrote, "For the Americans, the idea of Christianity and liberty are so completely mingled that it is almost impossible to get them to conceive of one without the other." The contemporary British historian Tom Holland was not yet a Christian when he was surprised to discover that he was much more Christian than he thought he was. He found that Western culture holds fundamentally different values from other and earlier civilizations. For Julius Caesar, the great Roman Empire, the number of enemy civilians and soldiers killed was a sign of strength. The more death, the greater the victory. But the longer the Christian faith worked in the minds and hearts of Europeans, the more our measure of strength changed. We still waged wars, but our moral judgment of them and our standards for them changed. And the violation of those standards, such as the Holocaust, became recognized as a mark of deep shame and guilt. Tom Holland shows that our values, our moral intuitions, have their particular character because our culture was shaped by the morning and noon of Christianity. Even though Tom Holland himself eventually became a Christian, Christianity itself in Europe and in my country has been weakened by decades of secularization. As a student and as an MP, I was often asked why I am still a Christian. It looks like there are new hopes for faith and church among the youngest generation in Europe. But there are good reasons why Thomas Halik speaks about the afternoon of Christianity. And there are clear signs that a similar process is taking place with democracy. The government by, of and for the people, as your President Lincoln famously put it, with free elections, with the rule of law and equal freedoms and rights for not only the majority that rules, but also for the minority that lost the election. In the morning, the sun rises, the birds start singing, flowers open up to the sun, and the world comes alive. In the early afternoon, the sun is at its strongest and the world runs at full speed. But in the afternoon, the sun begins to lose its strength. People grow tired. Nature prepares itself for evening and night, when all becomes dark and sometimes even threatening. Our democracy was born in the morning and flourished at noon, when we even thought that history had ended and there was no alternative to democratic rule. But now we are experiencing the afternoon of democracy, with tired politicians, with lack of inspiration, lack of new and unifying ideas, with growing division, and lacking ability to meet each other in the middle, with a lack of moral and inspiring leadership. And in Europe, with a lot of technocratic politics that no longer knows how to inspire. This is not the sadness of a former politician who thinks that after his departure everything only went downhill. No, it's a sober and a troubling observation. I want to point to 3 signs of our time, 3 writings on the wall that let us know that we are in the afternoon of democracy. Our first sign on the wall is that Western politicians and people are losing the ability to cooperate. In this world, Europe is a beacon of freedom and democracy. Within Europe, the Netherlands has long been a model of reasonableness and stability. Our democratic rule of law is a unique political system that on the one hand allows for wide differences, and on the other hand has the capacity, the ability to reach a broad, fully democratic consensus. What this requires is the ability to consult, to give and take, to cooperate. In the Netherlands, that ability has been highly developed. If we don't work together and find common ground, our dikes will crumble and half the country will be flooded by the rivers and the sea. So we have to work together. We don't have an alternative. Even if we don't like each other, as Protestants and Catholics in my parents' village weren't very excited about each other, we organized ourselves, respected others, our leaders sat around the table and came up with a way to live and let live. This ability to cooperate has brought social peace, economic prosperity to the Netherlands. Again, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville also looked on in the first half of the 19th century in your country, in the US, and he looked in amazement when he saw how Americans formed associations for practically everything and invested themselves collectively in their society. But this ability that we had is under pressure throughout Europe. In Europe, irreconcilable extremes are becoming stronger, so that majority governments can only be created if a wider range of centrist parties swallow their differences and come together in a coalition. But then becoming even less attractive to voters. Centrist parties are being driven into each other's arms, where they risk dying. Coalition governments are becoming increasingly fragile, and elections are becoming more and more frequent. Our coalition government just collapsed, and we will have elections in November again. Since 2010, we would have normally had 3 elections, and now we are at number 6. And in the past 5 years, our national coalition government has more often been caretakers than governing coalitions with new distinct policies. And in society, the number of strikes, a sign of disagreement, a disability to meet each other in the middle, the number of strikes has doubled. In France, just a little tour through Europe, in France, President Macron's political center is being crushed between the far left, even with communist parties, and the far right, which could win the next presidential elections. Every difficult governmental decision to curb public spending leads to strikes. In the UK, there is a Labour government that has already lost its credibility within a year. And the traditional two-party system dominated by Labour and the Tories is giving way to multiple new parties with much more radical views, both on the right and on the left. And in Germany, the political center almost died, and the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats barely managed to form a majority government. But the far-right AfD is growing by the day. There's one issue, one main concern that is causing the old parties to crumble and the populist right to rise, and that is immigration. And of course, every Western society faces the destructive consequences of social media. With stirring tweets and posts from the extremes, compromise in the political center is increasingly attacked, for both right and left. Not as a sign of civilization, but it's seen as a sign of weakness and betrayal of ideals. Sometimes it feels that we are living in the Weimar Republic. As you might know, that was the German democracy that ended in 1933. I told you, it won't be fun tonight. My second sign, my second writing on the wall, and that's Western democracies are losing the ability to pursue strategic policies. So in our democracies, we are busier with tweets and scandals than with major strategic choices for the future. Immigration is dividing European countries and societies, creating deep division, and still, maybe with only the exception of Denmark, no member state of the European Union, and also the EU as a whole, is able to manage immigration well, a clear sign of political weakness. Another example of this weakness is our energy policy. One of the largest and most consequential strategic choices Europe has recently made is to produce its own clean energy in the future. A big, bold choice with poor implementation. At the moment, China invests more than twice as much in its energy security than Europe. And for the energy of tomorrow, just to give you an example and an illustration, for the energy of tomorrow, 20 minerals are of critical importance. And of those 20 critical minerals, China dominates the processing of 19, with an average market share of 70%. And for 12 of the 20, China has restricted its export. Meanwhile, Western politicians attack each other with childish tweets, while China has taken control over the supply lines of nearly all critical minerals. The energy supply of democratic Europe now depends on the goodwill of the world's largest and most powerful autocracy. In short, major decisions and long-term strategic policies like managing immigration and energy policy are increasingly beyond the scope of European democracies. Then there's a third and last sign on the wall. That's a worldwide decline of democracy. Democracy in our time is less a sign of civilization and freedom, and increasingly seems a recipe for division and weakness. Democracy is losing its attractiveness. That's the third sign of the times. Earlier this year, Freedom House, a US organization, published its annual assessment of global freedom, covering both civil and political liberties, freedom under the rule of law and freedom in democracy. And for the 19th consecutive year, there has been a decline of these freedoms. 60 countries show deterioration, versus only 34 countries showing improvement. And only 20% of the world lives in a free society, in a free country. And for the first time in 20 years, there are more autocratic countries than free and democratic countries. These are the signs of the times, signs that we are experiencing the afternoon of democracy, and that it's beginning to dim. Now what? Can our democracy be saved? If we ask ourselves whether democracy can still be saved, that suggests that we treat democracy as an end in itself. Defenders of democracy often defend our political system like a group of scribes and Pharisees, loving rules, not people. I assume that many voters, even knowing that there are no easy solutions, will more likely vote for a politician who takes their concerns seriously than for a politician who tells them why the proposed solution is impossible or is not allowed. I am a defender of the democratic rule of law. As a Christian and as a citizen, I agree with Francis Fukuyama. So when I was studying here, he was one of my professors 18 years ago. And he wrote that there is no sustainable or moral alternative to our democracy. Maybe he was too optimistic when he wrote his famous End of History. But I share his conviction about the value of democracy and the rule of law. In Russia, anyone with an independent opinion can fall out of a window. In China, the state has assumed a godlike position, squeezing all freedom and creativity out of society. And in Iran, gay people are hung from cranes, and Christian pastors are being imprisoned, and women without headscarves languish in jails. These are not real alternatives to the personal and political freedom we enjoy. Our democratic rule of law best reflects who we truly are. We are creative, responsible people, made in the image of God, with the ability to cooperate, the freedom to do good, the freedom to make also foolish choices. It's the freedom that God gave us. But I do not believe that we save democracy by acting like a group of scribes and Pharisees, guarding the letter of the democratic rule book. Democracy is not an end in itself, but a means to work together for a just and free society. In defending democracy, democracy must be practiced, not preached. President Lincoln once spoke of democracy as government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as I mentioned before. Democracy began close to the people. It started with the people. But for many voters, it's no longer theirs. Too often it belongs to judges, treaties, or a government far away. If we want to save our democracy and freedom, it must once again belong to citizens, of the people, with associations that Alex de Tocqueville once admired when he was traveling through the United States, with a civil society where people shape their own neighborhoods, with democracy close, with local control over local public funds, with a big society where richer people really care for their neighbors, where privileged people fight for a brighter future for children with less privileges. You cultivate a democratic ethos not by preaching about democracy, but by practicing democracy, by doing society. Yet the question remains whether that is enough in practice, if that is enough to sustain our democracy. Because democracy also depends on pre-political moral conditions, acceptance of authority, care for neighbors, respect for people with different opinions, appreciation of community, morality on which laws are based, ideals and visions that can be pursued within a democracy. These are all pre-political moral conditions. So yes, you must practice democracy, but you also need a bit of faith. Not faith in the letter of the democratic rule book, but in the purpose of democracy, the meaning of democracy. The German political scientist Hartmut Rosa recently wrote the book, Democracy Needs Religion. He emphasizes that democracy needs communities, ethos, values. Indeed, that democracy needs religion. The problem with that observation is that it treats religion, faith, and ultimately God very functionally. But no one believes something just because it is useful or needed. You only believe something if you think it is true. God does not return because we can use him. We return to God only if we believe that he can save us. Christians do not hope in Jesus because he keeps things together here. He keeps society together. No, Christians hope in him because he speaks the words of eternal life. Therefore, Christian faith can only save us if we also want to be saved. This summer, I read a book of one of our great poets, Dutch poets, about her serious illness from which she will not recover. And she writes how she concluded that her atheism was inadequate for what she was going through. She then had an intense experience that made her believe God exists. I think we may reach a similar point in the afternoon of Western democracy. That we see that our democracy, our rules, are now insufficient. That we cannot manage it alone. That we are too divided, too polarized, too hostile to each other. And that we must call to God. As Christians, I see the first sign of a continent, and I'm speaking about the European continent, rediscovering its Christian roots. The Gen Z generation in Europe is the first youngest generation in a century that is more religious than the previous one. It's happening in the UK, in England, in Finland, in Germany, France, with a lot of people being baptized every Easter, and even in the Netherlands. Now, some of you might be thinking critically, a man from Europe, from a secularized part of the world, coming to the US, telling Americans that they need faith, that they even need God. Maybe some of you might shout out at me now, we have far too much faith, and maybe far too much God in politics. You're right. There are stadiums full of faith. Senators praying in the middle of the Senate floor, and earlier this year, an inauguration that had more praying clergy than speaking politicians. In both cases, Europe, that's more secular, and the US, faith alone is not enough. Equally important is good theology. Abraham Kuyper deeply believed in the truth of the gospel. As far as he was concerned, not all roads lead to Rome. For him, Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. He even broke away from our national Protestant church because a major part of the church were in his eyes too liberal. But that is, as he called it, the sphere of the church, in which it is all about truth. At the same time, he was politically fighting against the idea that the government should be imposing truth. In the own sphere of government, it's not about truth of particular faith, but it's about justice and freedom for all. He fought for room to be different. While believing in the uniqueness of Christ, he fought for pluralism in which his religious and political opponents had the same rights and freedoms as he wanted to have for his own Reformed community. He fought for freedom of education with equal treatment between public schools and Christian schools, and he won. His good public theology has shaped our nation. Good theology makes the distinction between what is of God and what is of Caesar. Good theology focuses on a Christ-centered church and a political system in which everyone has the freedom to believe and not to believe, with justice for all, as God makes the sun shine and the rain to fall on all. As convinced as you can be about Christian truth, good theology teaches us not to use the means of government to make our nation more Christian, or to fight for our God, or against religions and convictions that are different from ours, or to punish your opponents because they have the wrong ideas. Peter once took the sword to defend Christ, but he was wrong. Christ taught us that his kingdom is not of this world. Yes, democracy needs faith, but also a clear understanding of good public theology with the right place for faith and politics. As Christians, we can stand up for freedom, for pluralism, a legal framework in which also we ourselves have the freedom to be a witness of Christ. I come to an end. Ultimately, it also depends on us, on you, on me. Not only whether God is present in our divided and polarized societies, but whether we are present. Are we just looking? Are we spectators in a weary civilization that knows evening has come and that night is approaching? Or are we doing whatever we can while there is still light? In a beautiful French movie called Des Hommes et des Dieux, which is about a monastery in Algeria, that is the big question for the monks in this monastery. In a country torn apart in the 90s by the civil war between Islamic extremists and our authoritarian government. Should we leave or should we stay? The threat grew from Islamic extremists and from the army. And it became darker, more fearful. And when the abbot, the father in the monastery, asked in the final vote who wanted to stay while the night was approaching, hands went up, one by one. Not because the monks were heroes, actually they were afraid, they were fearful. But they believed they had to remain faithful to the place where God had brought them. They were martyred, but they are still a great example of Christian faithfulness and true love. And so we too can do what we want. We too can do what we can. We can be faithful and we can serve as good citizens of our country who know where our democracy comes from and what it is for. Not as spectators, but as actors, as doers of the word, while it is still day. And even when night comes, sooner or later, a new morning will break again. Thank you.
I'm going to give Chris the first response here, but I'd like to introduce him before I invite him into the discussion. And one of the joys of putting this event together is actually introducing these two men to each other in this lifetime. So I'm so excited for this. So Chris Seiple began operating at the intersection of religion and realpolitik in 2003 when he became the president of the Institute for Global Engagement and founded the Review of Faith and International Affairs. He has practiced relational diplomacy throughout Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East, and he played a significant role in the removal of Vietnam from the U.S. State Department's religious freedom violations list in 2007, and later Uzbekistan in 2019, about which he developed a theory of change. It's fascinating if you'd like to read it. He has served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State, chairing the Religion and Foreign Affairs Working Group, and as a senior advisor to USAID regarding the U.S. government's first ever summit on strategic religious engagement in 2020. He is co-editor of the Routledge Handbooks on Religion and Security and Religious Literacy, Pluralism, and Global Engagement, which is still free online, right? Thanks to the Fetzer Institute, that one is free online. And he's the co-creator of the Dialogue of Declarations. He's a senior fellow at Love Your Neighbor Community and the University of Haifa, and he previously advised the Templeton Religion Trust in their creation of the Covenantal Pluralism Initiative. So Chris, welcome. Why don't you make a few remarks and then we'll ask a couple of questions.
Should I take it on? Okay. Well, good evening. My name is Chris. I'm a Christian. I'm just very grateful for your remarks, and I keep thinking about several things. One is Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And we're in one of those moments where we have to decide what we mean. And I very much appreciate this idea of a realistic assessment. I hope you did not hear any pessimism in that talk, but it was realistic and therefore optimistic. You can't get anywhere practically unless you're realistic first. I also appreciate the signs of the times, and it made me think, of Matthew 12. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and says, you want signs of the times? Well, I'll give you the sign of Jonah, which can be read in a certain way where as sacred comedy, because the only good Jews in the book of Jonah are the Gentiles, who demonstrate what it means to be obedient before a sovereign God. And of course, the book of Jonah is what is being read today in synagogues around the world for Yom Kippur. And the attack on the synagogue in the UK is the realism that we're talking about. So 3 kind of meta comments maybe, and then I'll yield the floor. One is that attack in England. I hope you take away the fact that what he's talking about is not just there or here. These are global trends. There is a trend of religious nationalism, which is defined by a hubris, generally of the majority ethno-religious group against the other. It is not a faithful patriotism and a faithful pluralism, which is what I think you heard here, which is defined by humility and awe before the Creator, the uncreated Creator of the world. And so these trends are not going away. In fact, they're quite dangerous, and afternoon is the right word. The clouds of Mordor darken. They darken, and it's not just here, and it's not just in the Netherlands. My second thought, thinking about this, and it's a good reminder for Christians at least, is we worship a global God. And sometimes I think Christians who are in politics, I don't care what your party is or what country you're in, you get caught up in your own thing, right? Your own political party, your own country. And we kind of forget that the original global NGO is the church. And that we have a citizenship to our nation, but a global citizenship too. All in the name of the kingdom citizenship, if you're a Christian. And that's something to think about. I root that in my own reading of Paul, who is the Hebrew of Hebrews, Philippians 3. He was a Roman citizen. Cives Romanus sum. That's my extent of my 9th grade Latin. I am a Roman citizen, and I appeal to Caesar, Acts 25. And then, of course, he is the ambassador in chains, 2 Corinthians 5 and Ephesians 6. The national and the global citizenship are gifts to be stewarded pursuant the kingdom citizenship. And by the way, I think other faiths can come to their own conclusions about these three citizenships, spiritual, global, and national, as a way of talking about these things. My last comment is what has been called for. And one of these sub-comments is implied. I think we really do need to think about why democracy is not providing. I think we really need to think about, and this was not said, there are some who would say democracy is under attack and we have to do something. But you can't mouth cliches. You have to provide a realistic and optimistic assessment, but you also have to think about what has not been provided. Why are people interested in soft authoritarianism? Why is that? There are reasons for this in all these countries. That's why it's a global trend. How do you think about that? One answer to that was provided in the briefing. We need theology. We need good theology, and we need good public theology. If you don't have good public theology, then you will not have the presence that has been called for. And if anything, Christians are called to be present. Preach the gospel. Use words if necessary.
Thank you, Chris. All right, I want to start off with a couple of questions for you guys, and then be thinking of your questions as we're talking here. You've laid out some serious challenges for our societies. I would be guessing that some people are thinking to themselves, what do you think is a distinctly Christian response in this moment? How do we live faithfully in a cultural context that's sort of shaped by similar patterns, in some ways? At the Center for Public Justice, we do think that Kuyper's way of integrating faith and public life can help. Where should we start? A small softball question at the beginning.
Okay, let's go. I think we should start with Psalm 19:14. May these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my God and my Redeemer. I think we are too anxious to paint the other, even within Christianity, negatively. We forget the dignity that everybody has. We forget that they bear the image of God. And this is just fellow Christians, right? The same goes obviously for non-Christians. and we forget the fourth or the third great commandment of Jesus. Love God, love neighbor, but then go love other believers as I love you, because that's how they'll know who you are. And the things that we see in the press from Christians in any country, boy, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. So I come back to Psalm 19:14, and I think we need a whole lot more prayer before we get to policy.
Just to build on that, for me in politics, the real change came during COVID. So I was in politics between 2012. I mean, I was member of parliament between 2012 and 23, January 23. And it was in the summer of 22 that I decided, I mean, I cannot handle it anymore. I mean, it's getting really, really serious now. I mean, with threats and the impact on a family. And the change was in COVID time. And the toughest criticism of any policy, and we were part of the coalition government, came from Christians. So the harshest, the most difficult to read emails I got were from brothers and sisters in Christ. That was hard. That was really hard. And I always had like this idea when I explained my motives and I explained why I made the decision that I made. At least people understand. There will at least be a kind of understanding, and even they still disagree. Well, that's fine, but we still respect each other. So when you say where do we start? I mean, we start with ourselves. It always starts with your own words. It starts with your own writing. I mean, what do you think about others? What do you say about others? What do you write about others? And then I'm not saying that we should hug each other every day, especially not in Parliament. I mean, that's not a hugging place. I mean, that's a place to fight ideas and to battle, but it's about ideas, and then after that battle, I mean, you drink a cup of coffee and you sit down, and there is this assumption that, well, I'm fighting for my ideas and I'm fighting for what I believe is the right decision or the right thing to do, but I might be wrong. And that's the place of also a little bit of humility. Maybe I can learn something from what I hear from others. So it starts with an attitude of wanting to learn, and of course, still, I mean, I was battling as well, and well, there were times that I really liked these kind of battles. So I'm not saying that we all should be just only saying nice words to each other. No, when it's about right or wrong, or what is the right legislation, what is justice, I mean, you can have a real battle. But still, how do we think about others? How do we speak about others? And that starts with our own circles, Christians. And then it's hard to see that also now, like with whatever issue we're facing. I mean, we had like climate policy, we had like Ukraine, we had COVID. I mean, not related at all. I mean, very different issues. But you had the same divisions, same kind of dividing lines between the same kind of groups with disagreement and with distrust, and that was hard. That was really hard. So just start with yourself, and then what I also discovered, and then I will close, otherwise I'll start preaching. And I said we shouldn't preach. I mean, we should do it. What I was sometimes doing when I got this email from someone that was saying, well, you are the servant of Satan, or whatever they were saying, when I found out like who that person was, I mean, when I found out what telephone number they had, I gave them a call and said, well, can we do coffee? And then we had coffee several times. And every time we sat together and said, this is different. Sorry, I was a little bit frustrated with politics. You were the first one I was thinking about, and well, you got all the blame. Meeting each other, talking to each other, drinking coffee or whatever you drink here, that makes a difference. So that's what I meant with we need to do democracy locally, practically, personally. I mean, it starts in your own neighborhood. It starts with what is your first response when you disagree with someone? What is your first response when you have an issue in your church, in your family? That's where democracy starts. That's where we should start.
Thank you. You've spoken to the challenge that we do face as divisions within the body of Christ, because it's not just the cultural pressures that are dividing society, right? They're dividing Christians within our churches. You know, I think you spoke earlier about kind of the importance of truth. I would hold up, you know, another kind of Christian principle, one of unity. Are there particular things that you would offer as not just at the interpersonal, but also thinking within the larger structural of the church in particular, where you could help give some insight into how to navigate those divisions with an eye towards the preservation of truth and unity?
Yeah, thanks. Please go ahead. On the test run. No. Mark Tooley's in the room, and I'm a big fan of Mark's. He runs in the way back. Must be in the back row. He's the president of the Institute for Religion and Democracy. And after January 6th, he called me up, pessimistic, as we all were, and he asked me to write. And I wrote an article that related my experiences overseas in these authoritarian contexts, particularly living in Poland when I was a student, when it was still communist, to the times. And I concluded this talk, this article, it's called Amidst the Chasms, Our Chasms, which is a quote from Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel laureate from Poland. January 6th was a failure of discipleship. And I still believe that. I don't mean it as offense, but I mean it because I think it's true. The church is the last great hope for the world. Unfortunately, it's the least equipped. Because we didn't learn that in seminary, and we certainly don't learn it in Sunday school. And so this is the question of our times. I brought Russian pastors and Ukrainian pastors together in Istanbul in 2014, after the first invasion. And nobody knew how to even talk geopolitics. They kept saying, we don't know how to do this. We've been forced to reduce the God of history to Sunday and four walls. I don't know how to think about God as the God of geopolitics. And that's what we've got to recover in some ways. He's the God of immigration. He's the God of COVID. He's the God of testing, of all the stuff that's going on at HHS right now. He's there. So how do we get there? Part of it, and I'm going to, if I haven't offered my opinion already, and now I'm going to offer it. I don't think that our pastors, our journalists, our military personnel, I don't think we should know what they believe politically. I think they're there to help us be better citizens, depending on what the context is. I want a police officer that protects me. I want a fireman that shows up. I want a journalist who tells an even-handed story. And I want a pastor who tells me how to be a disciple of Christ. I don't want to know his or any of their or her opinion about the what. I want to know about the how. I want to know how Jesus engaged at the well. I want to know those things. As much as it is possible, be at peace with those around you. Those kinds of quotes from the Bible that Paul gives us and many others. We got to get back to that. If we can't do the how, we can't be present. And if we can't be present, we can't do policy.
I like the phrase that the church is the last hope of the world. The church is a miracle. I experienced the worldwide body of Christ in Egypt. At one point, I was sitting with a Sudanese head of a school, and I was in the board of the school for refugee children. And he had a Muslim background from a certain tribe, from an area that I've never been to, with a language that I don't speak, with cultural differences that are very complicated. And there were all kinds of issues. But when we spoke about Jesus, I mean, there was this sense of unity that I had with him. That's a miracle. I mean, he was so different. He was so completely from an other world. And it was this unity in Christ, and our hope was on the same risen Christ. And that was very, very moving. And I think when we rediscover that there's a oneness and there is a unity in Christ, I mean, that's the beginning and the end of all discussion. And then we can have our political discussions. I like political discussions. And we might differ. I mean, that's fine. But it will never separate us from that unity in Christ. So that's what we should celebrate in church. When I spoke about deep divisions in the Netherlands, now we have like so many, and as the United States is very multicultural, we have so many differences, cultural differences. And then you have like these meetings where Christians from different backgrounds come together and praise the same God. Then I think this is the last hope. But we need to do a better job. And we can do that. So, and there's, no, let's pause here. Otherwise I start preaching. I shouldn't.
Thank you. Your lecture, you described kind of pressure on democratic systems. I want to focus on one thing that you mentioned in your talk, right? This is an aspect of the work of government and kind of a key Kuyperian insight. We share among us this kind of conviction that obedience and love, when they are not given freely, are neither of those things. My question is, what does it mean for government to respect and uphold genuine pluralism of belief and of institutions? And how should governments themselves guard the space for people and institutions to live out their convictions?
I think government's job is to provide the space and make sure everybody has a seat at the table. Full stop. And I believe that government will always be downstream from culture and from the people. Our presidents, no matter what party they are, they're never a cause. They're the symptom. And so, again, back to presence, we need to think about these things and what it means and what we want as a people and how we engage our neighbors. And that will be reflected in our politics. I also think, back to Stephanie's opening, I think we need better terms of reference. Here I'm going to be a little bit academic, wonky, nerd guy. But we talk about diversity, and when we developed this funding initiative at the Templeton Religion Trust, we defined diversity as the presence of difference. It's not a goal. It's a demographic fact. And diversity is everywhere. And when I allow for somebody to be side by side but not engage them, that's tolerance. I allow for their existence, but I'm not going to talk to them. Pluralism, which we've talked about before, is the engagement of difference. That can be negative or positive, because it can be a little too touchy-feely. There are places in the world where there are fatwas against the word pluralism. We developed this term we call covenantal pluralism, because you have the right, and this is common sense, or we used to be, you have the right to bring your values to the table. And other people should listen respectfully, just as you listen to their values. And we created this framework that we call cross-cultural religious literacy, which I can preach a sermon on, but I won't. But the whole idea is that we got things to do together. It's not a question of if, but when you partner with somebody who doesn't look, act, vote, pray like you do. So get past your bad self and figure out a way to talk to them. But it's better to have a philosophy or a theology of partnership before the encounter that you have to partner with to solve sexual exploitation, to solve Ukraine, to solve COVID, and think about what the values are that inform that process. And therefore, from a secular sort of academic framework, we said, this is what it means to engage one another, to bring the essence of your identity to the discussion, and then expect the other person to do the same in order to collaborate so you can get stuff done. And in so many ways, people don't self-censor these days. from the left and the right. They don't want to talk about what they really think. This is happening in our universities, this is happening in our workspaces, and we need a framework that gives you permission to be who you are. And people do expect you to talk about the difference. Some of my closest friends in the world are Muslims because we can talk about the differences we believe about Isa al-Masih. That's Arabic for Jesus the Messiah as he's referred to in the Quran. We are never going to agree on his nature and his purpose, but we can talk about it because we have a respect for the essence of each other's beliefs. And we have to get into that kind of frame. We have to create spaces where we can have that encounter so we can take on the things that are common challenges as common citizens. Despite our differences, we can do it, but it takes work.
And differences can be very difficult. I mean, so I had these conversations with fellow Muslims and our fellow citizens who are Muslim. And it's hard. I mean, when they deny the uniqueness of Christ and that Christ is the Son of God, I mean, that's hard to digest. I mean, to swallow and to accept. But still, that's a civil discussion. And many times, I mean, it was much more engaged. I mean, they were much more engaged than any Dutch secular guy I would meet in the street, I mean, who's not interested in God at all. So you could have a very, very deep dialogue and conversation. The thing is, if you know for yourself how important faith can be and how it is guiding your life and giving deep inspiration and comfort in days of sorrow, hopefully that gives also a little bit of understanding what it means for people with another conviction, but also people of faith. We had an issue in the Netherlands, and that was about, I mean, are Jews and Muslims allowed to have their ritual slaughtering? So people were defending animal rights and they were saying, well, it's horrible, it's terrible, and we shouldn't allow it anymore. So it's a freedom that we had for 450 years. So when the Jews came from Spain and Portugal to the Netherlands, they were allowed to have their ritual slaughtering. It was only stopped in 1940, yes, when Germany invaded us, and when there was a Nazi regime. And now it was being under attack again. And in a way, it hurt. I mean, I can eat whatever I want. I have all the freedom. Ritual slaughtering is not an issue for me. I don't think, I mean, when I was eating a little bit of the meat there, I wasn't wondering, how has it been slaughtered, or no, it's all fine. But for them, it's to be or not to be. Can we really be part of Dutch society as Orthodox Jews, as certain Muslims? Then you need to step up and defend their freedom, because you know how important it is to be a recipient. I mean, that you receive freedom and you enjoy freedom. What helps in our society is, as mentioned before, the system of proportional representation. So 12 parties, good luck, terrible. But you're forced to sit around the table with people who are not initially your friends. I mean, with convictions you don't like. I mean, at one point during the negotiation, my first time that I was sitting at this table, there was one point, and it was about assisted suicide for elderly people. And I said, well, I will not be part of that. I mean, I will draw the line. And I thought now this negotiation will collapse and this will be the end of our talk. Because previously, and in earlier days, we had very heated and very nasty discussions about this issue and other ethical issues. It was not fun at all. As I said, I mean, I became an old man. It was hard. It was really hard. And at this point, I came to a point and said, well, sorry, guys. I mean, I won't be part of this. I mean, there is a certain limit in my conscience, in my conviction, in what I can be responsible for. This is it. And then, for the first time, in all these weeks that we were discussing, when I was opening my heart and explaining why it was so a critical issue for me and what values were at stake, then that was the first time that there was a connection, there was a kind of understanding. And that was like a turning point in the negotiation, that when you open your heart, when you share your deepest convictions, when you try to understand each other, why it is so important for the other and for yourself, it helps to live together. But what doesn't help is our social media. I don't know how it works here in the US, but it's a curse. I mean, it's making people not like people with other convictions or another opinion. No, they are enemies. They're enemies of the nation. I mean, they should be kicked out. And then you use whatever mean you have. And then you use, if you have the means of government, then it's not serving justice for all. That's not protecting justice and freedom for all. No, that's punishing your enemy, because you started to believe that they're really enemies, really bad people, waking up every morning thinking, how can we let this nation suffer, or how can we, whatever bad intention you think they have, till you sit around the table, open up your heart and ask a question and find out, I'm still not liberal. I'm not a liberal. I will hopefully never be a liberal. But I see deep convictions, I see certain values, and I see what they believe in, and I can value that. And they start to ask questions to me, and that's civilization, with deep differences, sitting around the table, asking questions, and somehow manage to meet somewhere in the middle.
All right, get ready with your questions, because this is my last. I want to ask about kind of our role, all of us here, as Christians in public life. It's very, very clear we can't sit on the sidelines from what has been shared tonight. And we all share responsibilities in our churches, but we also wear these hats as citizens, right? And there are folks who are in the room who serve in government or have roles in sectors of civil society like philanthropy. Would you offer a few remarks on sort of what's at stake if Christians sort of yield the space and fail to step forward faithfully in this moment? And what encouragement or advice would you offer Christians?
We might have already yielded the space, because I don't see anything in the public example of many Christians, left or right, that would betray their conviction, would reveal their convictions as followers of Jesus. I come back to this Psalm 19:14, pray, may the words and the meditations of your mind and heart be pleasing to God. The second thing is treat other Christians well, as I've already said. There was a New York Times thing earlier this week on Russell Vogt, is that how you say his last name? Card-carrying evangelical Christian, Wheaton grad. And there are a lot of people who have strong feelings about him. He could be the Antichrist to some Christians. But you know what I took away from that article? While that guy wasn't in power, he was sitting in some house that was pigeon infested and writing out his plan. Because he believed in it, and he believed it to be consistent with biblical values. Now, I can disagree with that, but the point is this: what's your plan? You got to have presence to do policy. But to do policy, you need a plan. So you can't complain, but you've got to come up with ideas that are just as good or better than other people. Because the cliche complaining doesn't get anybody anywhere. So here's some ideas. Why don't you start your own political party? Why don't you help the Republicans become Christian Democrats? This is Peggy Noonan talking a couple weeks ago. That's what's happening, she said. When I worked for Reagan, they were just fringe elements. We're happy to have them get their vote. Now they're the main element. Let them become Christian Democrats. Work with the Democrats. Governor Spanberger, she's going to win. Andy Beshear, Josh Shapiro. There are blue dog Democrats out there. They're not extinct. They're coming back. Work with them. Live out your values in either political party. But get in the game, but never sacrifice the how in the name of the what. Because then you betray your witness. And you're not called to be the best Republican or the best Democrat. You're called to be the best Christian you can be. And when you're the best Christian, you'll steward your American citizenship. If you may not win that day, or maybe even that election, but you win over the long term. And people recognize, and people know that.
And I would add that there are also other roles outside of politics. As a former politician and still involved in politics, I would say, find your own space. Find your own role. So I was mentioning Tom Holland, a very interesting, a very well-known historian, interesting figure. As I mentioned, became, while studying history, seeing the impact of Christianity, going back to the source of it, Christ, became Christian and is now also part of the Church of England. He was saying, oh my goodness, Christ really changed history. Why was that? That was not through political power. For ages we were just a minority, we were just helpless people. But it was a revolution that started from the cross, and it was an agapeic revolution, agape. It was unconditional love. And all of a sudden, there were people going to people with leprosy and people with all kinds of diseases and poor people and infants that were just thrown in the streets and taking care of them. That was the revolution. So politics came out of it, and our values, our political values and system came out of it, but it all started with the individual follower of Christ finding its own role, its own calling, doing whatever God calls you to do, and you find out when something really hits you, when something breaks your heart, when you see an opportunity and you know, oh my goodness, now I have to do something. Then you're part of this revolution that's already going on for 2,000 years. And that's not primarily a political revolution. So we shouldn't fall into the trap that we can bring God's kingdom closer by political means. Probably not. But you embody Christ when you serve like Christ, when you find your role and you're part of this movement that's going on for 2,000 years. And as Tom Holland was touched by what he discovered and what he saw, that's what's happening as an encouragement. Sometimes when we were living here, some people in church came up and said, well, you're Christian and you're from Holland. Are there Christians in Holland? And still people think that Europe is, it's gone. It's a dark place. And now just seeing that, I was just talking to someone right before we started here. There was a fire in the Notre Dame in France, in Paris. We all saw that. Now this year, the number of people being baptized at Easter in France doubled again. Year after year, it's being doubled. So it's really on the rise. And then this year and last year, they asked, what is the reason? Why do you want, how did it start? For 20% of them, it started with the fire in the Notre Dame. They said, oh my goodness, this is a church, this is our soul, this is religion, and that was the start of a search. I see it in the lives of my daughters and their friends. Bible study groups being formed with new believers, young people, and oh my goodness, I've only seen decline in my life. And now there's new signs of life, and that's encouraging. So even when you don't see these signs, still it's our calling to be faithful and to do what we have to do. So my encouragement would be find your own place. Play your role and do what God asks you to do. And I guess you know what you have to do.
So thank you again. Thank you, Gert-Jan and Chris. And thank you for joining us in person tonight. You had a card on your seat tonight with a QR code that you can scan if you want to sign up for additional information about CPJ, including the recording of tonight. We will send it to you so you can share it with your friends. We look forward to staying in touch. Please feel free to stick around in the space. These guys will be available for a little bit here, and we'll just welcome the opportunity to see you again. Thank you.